So welcome everyone. Really appreciate everyone taking time from their Saturday, whether it's their, morning or their afternoon or their evening. Not to mention if you're, in a time zone where it's already Sunday, probably Sunday night. So yeah, welcome to this session. This is about Power Automate tips, tricks, and real life examples. So before we go any further, thank you to our sponsors and partners. Thanks to Bonaire, Microsoft 365 Saturday and European Collaboration Summit. People think that virtual conferences are just, like that. They're not. They are work. Their work has to be done. They, can easily have a budget. So things cost money these days, even though we're doing things over Teams. So thank you to the sponsors. Now we have some prizes and some raffles. So remember to visit the Bonaire Virtual Bar and be present at 8 p.m. UTC2 during a raffle. Without further ado, a brief couple of words about myself. There's a lot of, actually, it seems I took away the bullet points, but a lot of text there. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through that all. So my name is Antti Pajunen, and I'm a Power Platform person. I guess my official title is Power Platform Advisor. My history is with Dynamics 365 customer engagement / CRM / kind of whatever you kind of want to call it. I'm a CRM guy at heart, and naturally have transitioned into the wonderful world of Power Platform as that platform has really become more mainstream, and that CRM stuff is kind of somehow it's not diminishing, but kind of is diminishing. I'm a BizApps MVP for the second year, and I primarily actually focus on project service automation and project operations. And I just happen to be a really big fan of Flow because that has really transformed the way I work as a no-code person. So about the agenda today, I'm going to very briefly explain Power Platform as I personally see it. And I want to do that because I think everyone has a different angle and a different mindset to what Power Platform actually is. And then from that, let's jump into some tips and tricks based on my personal Flow experiences. I do have a pretty heavy set of slides. Now, don't be alarmed. There's actually some, to me at least, some golden stuff in there. And then based on those slides, we're actually going to cover all those points in a live demo. So with that, Microsoft has these 3 clouds, and actually the latest cloud, I think Kayla is doing a presentation at the same time. Kayla probably has an updated slide from this. Microsoft doesn't actually consider them 3 clouds, but a single cloud anymore. But Microsoft has, you can still consider these the 3 clouds, like Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, as well as Azure. So that's kind of where we're coming from. Now, how is this related to Power Platform? How is this related to Power Automate? Well, glad you asked. So the way I see it is Power Platform is really that piece that brings these different clouds together. Those siloed bits and pieces are one homogeneous whole with Power Platform. Now, as we know, Power Platform has Power Apps to act on data, Power BI to analyze data, Power Automate to build automation and workflows, and Power Virtual Agents to, I call it act and automate. And really, Power Platform as a whole is what combines those clouds. Now, a single element in Power Platform is, at least to me, at the very center. That's truly that glue that holds things together. And in my opinion, that is Power Automate. So that really is that glue that brings all those separate bits and pieces from those 3 different clouds, whether it's Azure Blobs, Azure File Storage, Azure Active Directory, whether it's some things from Office, Microsoft to-do lists, you name it, or things from Dynamics, such as some of the first-party applications, sales, customer service, and whatnot. And with Power Automate, we can take those 3 clouds and bits and pieces from those 3 clouds and really glue things together to build valuable business solutions. All right, so that was really briefly Power Platform as I see it. So let's jump to kind of like the core of this session, to flow tips and tricks. And by the way, if anyone has any questions now that I'm presenting, I don't see if someone's doing that raise your hand thing. So just unmute, ask a question. Otherwise, I might miss it. Or if someone is moderating, by any chance moderating the chat, please feel free to interrupt me. So let's dive into connectors first. So connectors for D365 and Common Data Service. Now, really the takeaway from these connectors is that if you're still using the D365 connector somewhere, start refactoring your flows, because that connector is deprecated. You should not use that connector anymore. I'm not entirely sure if that's even available for new flows, but if you see that in an old flow, you really should do something about that. You should either use the older CDS connector or preferably the new Common Data Service current environment connector in any flows that you make. Now, that said, really the difference between the older CDS and the current environment connector is that the CDS CE one, the one that you see on the right, that's the kind of like the de facto connector that Microsoft is putting all their development work into. So that is the one that you should use when you're creating new flows. Now, if you do have a requirement to bring in data from multiple different environments inside a tenant, then the older CDS connector, at least at the moment, would be an option for something like that. I think even that's changing with the current environment connector at some point. So unless you're, kind of integrating or pulling together data from different environments in your tenant, you just go with the current environment connector. That's the one you should use. Now, choosing that can be a little tricky, and this probably depends on how big your screen is, how your zoom is, and whatnot. But that might not be the most obvious one to kind of pick out. So to pick out the CE connector, the current environment one, that's the one that has those 3 ellipses next to the icon. So that's the one that you should choose when you're building your triggers and when you're building your actions. Now, the cool thing about this is that, and again, consider if you've used the older CDS connector in the past, and you have flows where you have a flow that fires off on create and a flow that fires off on update. With the CE connector, you can actually have just a single flow, a single trigger that'll fire off on either create, update, or delete. So essentially less flows are needed. So that could even be something where you might want to consider and evaluate refactoring some of your older flows if you have, scenarios where, again, you have those 2 flows, one for create and one for update. Now, there's less baggage for you to update them down the line or if something happens. All right, so let's kind of get to the nitty-gritty. So if you're only taking away like 2 or 3 things from this presentation, one of those is that, and the first one of those is that use OData style filter expressions to filter your triggers. That is really powerful. With filter expressions, you can control when your flow fires off and when it doesn't. And that'll essentially cut down on flow runs and unnecessary API calls. So filtering using OData style filter expressions can be really, really powerful. Now, there's 2 ways to do that. You can either go to those 3 ellipses, the image that you see on the left, and those 3 ellipses there. You can either go there and then to settings and really define a trigger condition, but I would prefer to use that OData style filter expression. Now, I have heard comments from different people that sometimes that OData style doesn't work for some reason, and you have to use those trigger conditions, that the ones that you see on the right. I've not really figured out when that exactly happens, but just kind of keep that in mind that sometimes you might actually need to visit that pretty horrible looking piece of string that you see on the right and kind of learn how to punch that in. Now, if you want to learn more, then go to Eliza Benitez's What the Flow blog. It's always a challenge to, say the last word of that correctly. So it is What the Flow. For additional tips and tricks on conditional expressions. So that was the first thing that you should take away. Filter your triggers. Now, let's kind of move on to one of the most, I would argue, one of the most common actions that at least I use in flows. And remember again, like I said, my background is with customer engagement with Dynamics 365. So a lot in this presentation is focused on common data service. And I do have some love for Office Graph and for those kinds of things, but for Office fan boys and fangirls, this is primarily common data service oriented. Sorry for that. No, I'm not sorry for that. So list records is one of those actions that you'll probably use the most. And what you want to do with list records is, and this is the second thing that you should take away, is always filter your results. If you don't filter your results, you might hit a threshold where your flow, where your list records just doesn't fetch anything anymore. Now, the threshold is pretty, the threshold is pretty big as it is, but if you're doing an enterprise grade or a flow to an enterprise grade system, then filtering is really important. And not only because of, you can make sure that you get all your results, but your flows will also run possibly even considerably faster. So learn the basics of OData syntax. It's definitely worth it. And filter those list records actions. Now, a nice thing about the CE connector is, and I think this is probably still something that a lot of people don't know, and I like bringing it up. Use pagination for large data sets in excess of 5,000 records, and that has really, grown. And to my understanding, the threshold is a bit over 100,000. Now, if you need to go higher than that, so again, if you're in an enterprise grade or in an enterprise system and you need to, list 500,000 or 1 million records for some reason, that sounds a lot, but maybe there's a use case for it. Then you should consider some sort of batching operation. So as long as you're fine with up to a bit over 100,000, you can turn on pagination on your list records actions and you're all set. All right, so now to some fine details about that list records action. So how do you actually use those filter queries in your list records action so that you can get the results that you want? So if you're filtering based on a string, what you need to do is you need to put that string inside single quotes. So as you see on the left, I have first name equals and Mike is in single quotes. Now, it's a little bit different if you're filtering based on an integer, such as an option set value, because in that case, that integer goes without single quotes. So for example, on contacts, preferred contact method equals 1. That number 1 is, that's not in single quotes, so it's without those single quotes. So, flow is full of these kinds of small details and kind of small things to understand. What I usually do myself is, nowadays I actually use a presentation that I'm giving you, this deck, as my reference when I need to come back to these, because I don't remember all of these off the top of my head. Sometimes it might be a month or even 2 months that I don't do flows if I'm doing something else, and then I'm like, how is this expression? How is this filter query again? How is I supposed to write that? So I visit this presentation myself, and that's kind of the reason why I've built it and the reason why I'm sharing it with you as well. Another option would be to just put these in your OneNote so that you would have a quick reference to some of these things. All right, so still keeping on with that list records things, and as I mentioned, that's probably one of those actions that with CDS you're going to use the most, and you're going to have the most use for. And I'd argue that that single action is something that has been one of those reasons how my work personally has, my work has transformed a lot through Power Automate. So if you're filtering based on a lookup, again, that filter query changes. So what you need to do is you need to put an underscore and the logical name, and underscore, punch in value, then type equals EQ, and then put in a GUID. So if you're filtering based on a lookup, you're going to put the record's GUID after that equals. Now, again, it changes if you're filtering based on a record's GUID, then what you're going to do is you're going to put the entity primary key, which is, for example, account ID, and then equals and the GUID of the record. So these are two, these are two of those things that I most frequently still have to visit this deck, because for some reason I just keep forgetting about them. They just don't seem to stick in my head. But don't worry, that's why the presentation is for all of you as well. And like I said, I'm going to cover these in the demo. Now, when that is not enough, when you need to use fetch XML, and some of you right now might be like, fetch XML is like, I consider that code. I'm not going to do fetch XML. I don't know how to do it. I don't want to learn it. Don't worry about it. I can't write fetch XML myself either. For that, I use Jonas Rapp's fetch XML builder. I mean, don't work too hard. Use that to build your fetch XML. You definitely, in today's world, in today's Power Platform world, you don't have to learn, fetch XML and how to, type that query on your own. You can just use fetch XML builder. But fetch XML is really powerful to get complicated records back. So when your filter query isn't enough, go with fetch XML. And it's actually pretty surprising how often you really have to use fetch XML to get back those records that you really desire. And this is very, very, for a non-technical consultant especially, this is very powerful. This is very powerful because now you can get and achieve results that normally developers were, that you needed a developer for. Now with, especially with fetch XML and less records, you got some really powerful options in your hands. Now, like I said, a lot of this is common data servers. I do have to give some love to all the, all Microsoft 365 and Office people. You should really learn some of the basics of Microsoft Graph, because that's another thing that really, really opens up the world for you. The world's going to be your oyster when you learn the basics of Microsoft Graph. That can be super powerful and help you out in your work a lot. There's a simple connector for that, HTTP with Azure AD. You can use that to delete, patch, post, or put against Graph. And with that, you don't need to expose your client secret in your connectors. Now, this one does not work for all scenarios, so sometimes you do need to go back to that HTTP, its classic connector, that premium HTTP connector to achieve a bit more. But in many cases, the HTTP with Azure AD works just great. Kudos to John Liu for some awesomeness about parsing JSON. So if you really want to dive deep into the world of JSON and how to parse it, check out John Liu's blogs. There's some like mind-blowing stuff there. That guy is just amazing. All right, so part 2 of tips and tricks. And let me check on time how we are. 20 minutes. I gotta hurry up. So there's 2 things that I told you to take away. One was that filter query for triggers, and the other one was for list records, filter for list records. Now, concurrency control on your trigger. Be very careful with this one. If you are using concurrency control on your trigger and you're not 100% sure what you're doing, you're going to have nasty results. So for your triggers, for your For each actions, for your loops, don't worry about it. You got no problem there. You can always go back and turn it off. But for triggers, when you turn concurrency control on for triggers, there is no way you can go back unless that has very recently changed. It doesn't help if you delete your trigger and add a new one. You actually got to rebuild your entire flow. So it would suck if you built, spent 2 days on a major flow and you happen to turn this on. I mean, that's definitely not happy times. So, takeaway number 3, do not touch concurrency control on trigger unless you're 100% sure of what you're doing. Now, a cool new, kind of newish thing, maybe this has been out for about 6 to 9 months or something like that, is secure input and output. So this is really useful for example, those scenarios where you have to store your client's secret and your tenant ID and your app ID and those things in your flow. If you do, you can secure your input and your output in connectors so that no sensitive data is revealed. And like I said, for those apply to each loops, there's no risk using these here from a point of not being able to turn them off. These can make your flows run a lot faster when you turn on concurrency control for your apply to each loops. Now there is a gotcha to this. So this is trial and error, especially you're using if you have variables, you're initializing and setting variables, and you're using apply to each loops, your flows might fail. So trial and error, see what the degree of parallelism is that works for your flow, and do good testing. Test thoroughly and use this in that sense with caution. If you're doing something like get records, like what we have here on the left, you can pretty much just a lot of times crank it up. But with things like variables, do bear in mind that you might see failures in your flows if you crank your degree of parallelism up all the way to the right to where it says 50. But this will really make your flows faster. So it's a really good thing to use. Now, error handling, that would be probably tip number, are we at tip number 3 or tip number 4? Configure run after. This is error handling for flows. Always remember to build this in so that you don't get unwanted results. And this is where you kind of have to think of various different scenarios where your flow might fail. So using configure after, if you're an overly positive person, then you're going to see negative results with this. So I mean, if you're a negative person at heart, then you'll be ready for for the downfall and where the world is burning. You'll be ready for this. So you kind of have to take a negative attitude with configure run after, and always consider that dark side, and that those downsides and those scenarios where stuff might hit the fan. But it's super important to consider this and try your flows in various different ways so that you can escape unnecessary errors. And we're going to cover this in the demo that we're going to do in just a few minutes. Now, change sets. These are kind of cool. So change sets, still to my understanding today, a change set is a single API call. That's my understanding. Someone correct me if I am wrong. But change, you can execute change set requests and flows these days. There is some gotchas to that. So operations are rolled back if an action fails. So that's the cool thing. Create a new account. The next action fails. The previous one is rolled back. The thing is, if something fails inside that change set and you don't have error handling built in, your flow will fail. And again, I have an example of this in the demo flow. All right, so then takeaway number, are we at 4 or 5? I think I went over, I think I said take 3 things away. I lied, take 5. So child flows. super powerful way to organize your flows into smaller chunks and to kind of dissect your big picture logic into smaller containers. Now your flows will be a lot easier to manage when you build child flows below your parent flows. That's just, you know, the bigger and larger your flow is, the slower it'll get to edit and the harder it'll be to diagnose the logic. So kind of think of ways of building that main piece, that core, that parent, and then build child flows for specific pieces of logic and action with child flows. All right. So when you're building those child flows, and you know, huge kudos to Thomas here. Sometimes you might see an embedded connections error in your child flow. Now you can read more about that on Thomas's blog. And one thing that, you know, can help you out with this, if you do see it, is change your Power Apps trigger that you might have used. So you have two options for child flows: manually trigger a flow and that Power Apps action. Changing your Power Apps trigger, sorry, not actions, but triggers. Changing your Power Apps trigger to manually trigger a flow trigger is a way to overcome the embedded connections error. But like I said, check out Thomas's blog. This is really good and can easily help you several hours in diagnosing it if you're, you know, just getting started with child flows. Now, a very frequent thing that people ask, this is probably one of the most frequent things: clearing lookup fields. How do you do that? A simple null doesn't work with the CDS-CE connector. So what you have to do is use the unrelate records action. There's a bit more work to it than just punching in null, but hey, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So yeah, for clearing lookups, you have to use the unrelate records action. Now, setting lookups, this used to be, and I think it probably still is, I think people have gotten more used to this now than, you know, how it was just 3 or 4 months ago. But setting lookups it's a bit tricky with the CE connector, current environment connector as well. So setting lookups, what you actually need to do is you have to put in the entity name in plural, followed by the related GUID in parentheses. So for example, accounts, and then the GUID of that account inside parentheses. Now the trick here is that the schema/logical names are not always what you think they are. So for example, case is incident, activity is activity pointer, and invoice line is invoice detail. So those can be a bit tricky sometimes. I've had the entity reference dynamics, entity reference open so many times looking for those schema and logical names. Frequent expressions. This is sort of the last session or section before we're going to jump into the demo. We have about 15 minutes to go. So check if a list record action returns any records. This is fairly often used in flows. So I'm not going to read that back. You know, you can get it from the deck afterwards, but that's, you know, just kind of keep that in mind, that's checking if a list record action returns any records is actually something you're going to use fairly, you know, I'd actually say fairly often, or at least I do. Also something that I use very often, compose the first return of record from a list record action. So if I want to avoid that, apply to each loop. So, you know, if I put in a list records action and then I put a get records, I'll get the loop, right? Now, I don't want that loop a lot of times. What I might want is just you know, I've filtered my results. I've filtered that list records action, and I just want the first record. So for that, you can use the first body expression like this. Now, another thing with that is, you know, sometimes I just want a single value from the first returned record in a list records action. Sometimes I'm just interested in a single, in a single value for a single field. For this, you actually have two options. The one that you see on top returns your result correctly, if it can find that result. Otherwise, if there is nothing to be found, your flow will error out. So that's why what you could do is you could use that instead of using that dot that you see in the expression higher above, you can just use a question mark. So the expression is built a bit differently, but again, error handling. This is again one of those error handling tricks. All right, so if you really want to go, all out, I guess, get wild with flow, you can also do something to compose a string from a value. So example would be if you don't remember the name of the entity when you're setting up a lookup field, what you could do is use a first split, last split to, compose that entity name. Now, for some, this might be a bit far-fetched, but actually first split, last split is something that I use fairly often, I would argue. I mean, there's lots of use cases for it. All right, so then kind of back to the world of HTTP requests. So if you want to choose a certain value from an HTTP request instead of using parse JSON, what you can do is have a body expression like the one that you see here. So that's a way to get a certain value without having to use parse JSON. And with that, it is time for demo. So let's go over these same things that we did on the slide decks, and let's look at those inside an actual flow. All right, so here, let's close that scope. I've been looking at that everything is just fine. So let's look at our trigger first. So that concurrency control for my trigger is turned from settings. I'm not going to go there, so I don't want to touch it. And remember, that's that thing that if you change it, you're changing it for good. So what I'm doing for my trigger is I'm filtering it so that this flow fires off when on a contact, when a contact is updated and the contact's flight name is Mike and the contact's last name is Ipsum and the contact's email address is Mike Ipsum at blah, blah, blah. So this is a powerful way of filtering triggers to only fire off when something very specific happens. All right, so let's check the next thing. So let's this whole flow, if I wouldn't have scopes, if I wouldn't use scopes, this would be almost impossible to understand and read. I mean, I'm still having a hard time understanding when I'm going through it, to be very honest. But if I didn't use scopes, it would be crazy. So scopes can really organize your flows into you can organize your flows so that they're more easily readable by using scopes. That's what I was trying to say. All right, so the first thing that we're doing is we're updating a contract record, and we're trying to clear it with the company name lookup by using null. So I'm going to hop over to another tab here. So I have a previous run of this same flow in this other tab. So I'm going to jump between these two tabs fairly fast. So try to do your best to keep up or watch the recording afterwards. So as you can see, I've used null and that action has failed. Now, what does this mean? It means that I've built in error handling. So now, if I wouldn't have error handling, my flow would fail. And the interesting thing here is that error handling is actually built to the next action. So it's not built into this one, but this one right here, if we go to settings, this one says, no, I'm going to go to settings. configure run after is that the configure run after in the following action, after the one that fails, has that error handling step. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm unrelating those records. And then in this one, I'm doing an update. So as you can see, to populate this lookup, what I'm doing here is I have that accounts in plural and then that GUID in parentheses. And here I'm unrelating it again. And in the next action, I'm again populating that same lookup. And I'm doing that first split, last split expression. So this way I don't have to punch in accounts if I don't know the entity, the entity schema logical name. I can just use first split, last split. Usually, personally, I do end up going to the entity reference to, dig things out if I can't remember them off the top of my head. Now, compose random string is pretty cool. So this is a long and random string. The word cool, and this one is the one that we're interested in. So this is what that first split, last split now does. So how do we get that word cool that we're interested in from this random string? So what we do is we use first split, last split. This is the expression. And with this, we can dissect cool from this string. And if we look at the flow run, cool is composed. Well, that's pretty cool. And that's something I've used actually pretty much in my flows. All right, so moving on, let's look at change sets. So here is a change set that's being executed. I'm creating a new account, and then I'm updating a contact record. But what I'm doing in that is, I'm using null. So, we just covered this. So this is going to fail. So the goal is that this, even if this change set fails, I do want to go over to this next scope that contains information about strings. So I need to build error handling. How do I do that? How do I build error handling into a scope? Do I put that into the list records action? Or where do I do that? All right, so let's look at what I have under these three ellipses on the scope and under this configure run after. It's built into the scope, right? The scope is the next action that follows the change set. It's not the list records one, but it's the scope. So in this case, you're building error handling into that scope. So let's see the flow run. Let's close out of this. We can see that creation of new account originally was successful, but that update of a contract record failed. So the creation of a new account record was rolled back. So an account record was not created. And without this error handling step here, it would be game over. My flow would fail. But with error handling, we're going to hit the scope, the string scope. All right, so let's dive into that. And let's look at list records. All right, so we have a list records action that's filtered by Mike. And what we want to do here on the left is we want to grab the first returned record, the first returned contact record as a whole. And then the other thing is the next compose is we just want to compose, we want to grab that first name from that returned record from the body. So let's look at, and actually, let's look at the facts. The facts composes, list records composes on the right as well before we jump into the actual results flow. So for this, I want to return a fax number. All right, so we have an error handling step here. So I guess what's coming up. This is going to fail. So there is no fax number. So if this compose was built like this, it's game over again. But if we put in that question mark, though that our flow will, keep on running. So let's look at the run history. And no, we don't want concurrency control just yet. We were in string. So this is that first returned record, that whole body of the record, like everything that's in it. And here, we're just interested in Mike. So with that expression, we composed Mike. Here we have that failed fax number. So no fax number is present. Ooh, that looks pretty nasty. Without error handling, our flow would fail. Now we had that single question mark in, so fax is optional. If you don't have fax number, your flow is not going to fail. This is what you get. You get that cryptical inputs, click to download, outputs, get to download. Essentially, there's nothing there. All right, so let's move on. We have a couple of more minutes to go. So let's look at listing records and listing records integers, and then let's look at our secure inputs and outputs. This is really just to demo what secure inputs and outputs do. There's not, this piece of listing integers you're proposing doesn't have any other meaning than just to demo the secure input and secure output. All right, so as you can see that here on the left, we'll see an integer, and here on the right, that value will be sort of sanitized. We're not going to see it. So if we jump back to the flow run, and we look here on the left, this expression returns an integer 1. There's no filtering, there's no secure input output. If we look to the right for secure input output, hey, we're not seeing anything. We're not seeing anything here. So this is for those client secrets and tenant IDs and those kinds of things. It's powerful for those. All right, let's move on. We're running out of time. So concurrency control. Concurrency control. What are we doing here? We're listing our records based on a lookup. So this is that filter query for lookups. And this is our list records filter query that is based on a GUID. So what are we doing? We are on a contact right here, on a contact. We're listing our contacts. And what this filter query says is, look at a returned contact record where parent customer ID equals to what we have here in this dynamic content, a GUID. Now, this other option is on our account records. On our account records, list an account that equals this and this, a GUID of this and this. So 2 different ways of listing your records based on a lookup or based on a GUID. Here's our fetch XML. List records, list all my projects. And I wonder if I can quickly read what this is doing. List all my projects where account is beer company. And then do an apply to each and get all those related project records. Yes. So let's look at the flow run. And what we have here is 34 beer company related projects returned. All right, couple of more things to go. I think I had 50 minutes for this session. Q&A is coming up, just a few more things. What happens if I am listing all my accounts and I'm filtering based on an account called bogus account? I don't have that in my system. Now, what I want to do is if this list records action for accounts does not return an account named bogus action, go here. Now, if that account is returned, then essentially terminate this flow, but this does not exist. So with this expression in this condition, I can see if that list records action contains anything or not. All right, and the last thing that we're going to cover is child flows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a child flow. I have a compose hello, compose world. I'm then running a child flow, and I'm composing an array from that child flow. So these are just compose actions, and this run a child flow has some inputs, and then I'm composing an array from that child flow. This is essentially what that child flow looks like. So I have this power apps trigger right here. Now, if I had that error that I mentioned about, you would change this to that manually trigger a flow trigger to overcome the issues that we mentioned earlier. All right, so here's the inputs. We're composing an array, and we're responding back in a child flow. And oops, wrong one, right here. And boom, we are composing an array from that. All right, we don't have enough time for that Microsoft Graph love anymore. It's basically an invoke an HTTP request action, some parse on that. We are short on time. We're at 47 minutes, I believe. So we have 3 minutes for Q&A if anyone has any questions.